Mr. President, in about an hour, we're going to take a vote that our service members around the world will likely be watching. It's a critical vote on my colleague from Vermont's amendment to blindly cut defense spending, taking a hatchet to the already agreed-upon Bipartisan Budget Act. You've seen my colleague, Jack Reed from Rhode Island, his really strong leadership on the Armed Services Committee. He just spoke out against it, and I'm going to speak out against it, Mr. President. And I want to spend some time explaining what this means. This is not just one amendment. This has national implications. And if you're watching in America, I want you to think about what's really going on here. So, first of all, my colleague from Vermont says it's a 10% cut, but it's going to exempt military personnel and health care accounts, which is true. That's true, part of the amendment. But it's actually going to compensate for the other cuts. So it's actually a 14% across-the-board cut to the Department of Defense. So that's the amendment we're going to vote on. Mr. President, to paraphrase one of our great presidents, Ronald Reagan, there they go again. There they go again. I chair the Readiness Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. One of the reasons I ran for the Senate in 2014 was exactly this issue of military readiness. As a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves, I have a little bit of an up-close and personal view on it. But readiness of our forces, second term of the Obama administration was plummeting. Second term of the Obama administration, defense spending was cut by 25%. And with that, the readiness of the men and women in the military plummeted. By the way, at the same time, defense spending was cut by 25%. Russia was increasing defense spending by 34%, and China was increasing by 83%. So let me just give you an example, Mr. President. These numbers actually were classified. They've been declassified since, but in 2015, when I arrived in the Senate, these were some of the numbers relating to readiness. Remember, we're supposed to be in charge of readiness here. 3 of the 58 brigade combat teams in the U.S. Army, the brigade combat team is the 5,000 men and women deployed block in our military. 3 of 58 were at the Tier 1 level of readiness that you wanted for a deployed unit. You can understand why that was classified in 2015, because we certainly didn't want our adversaries to know that. So 5% of the U.S. Army was fully ready to fight. Less than half of Marine Corps and Navy aviation could fly. Another classified number, now unclassified. Training and flight time for all military pilots plummeted. When I arrived here in 2015, the Obama administration proposed a cut of another 40,000 active duty troops for the U.S. Army. One of the units they were looking to cut was the 4th Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division, the 425 at J-Bear. In Alaska, the only airborne brigade combat team in the entire Asia Pacific. I put every ounce of my energy into fighting that misguided decision, Mr. President. The 425 was not cut, thankfully. All 40,000, the rest of the 40,000 were cut. We're still digging out of that hole. So, Mr. President, I want to throw something out there because people don't think about it. Imagine had there been a major contingency or, yes, a war. Sometimes wars hit us when we're least expecting, and I'm going to talk about that, in 2015 with these readiness numbers. I'll tell you this, Mr. President, it would have been very ugly for not only our national security, but more importantly for our troops, for the men and women who we are supposed to make sure are trained so they never have to go into a fair fight. So we know they're always going to win. Mr. President, we just celebrated the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. That's June 25th, 1950. Now, I'm a bit of a Korean War history buff. And I'll tell you this, what we didn't celebrate, what happened in the summer of 1950 at the outbreak of the Korean War. Here's what happened. The greatest military power in the world in 1945, which was the U.S. military, just won World War II. By 1950, due to dramatic defense cuts, lack of training, lack of readiness, our military had a very difficult time halting the invasion of a third world army, the North Korean army. For the history buffs who understand Korean War history, the military certainly does. They know what Task Force Smith was. It was the first American unit that went to go stop the Korean army, North Korean army. Task Force Smith was obliterated. Hundreds killed in the summer. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, thousands of young Americans died horrible deaths during the summer of 1950 because the leadership in Congress, the leadership in the executive branch, and the leadership in the Pentagon let the readiness of our armed forces plummet. Let me repeat, 70 years ago, right now, if you look back 70 years ago, the summer of 1950, on the Korean Peninsula, thousands of young Americans were being killed because they weren't trained and they weren't ready. This was probably one of the biggest derelictions of duty in U.S. history. Because it's a forgotten war, not many people know about it. But it was a dramatic failure of leadership in the Congress, the executive branch, and the military. And the military even has a saying for this: no more Task Force Smiths. We will never, ever, ever let our young men and women go fight a war where they're unprepared, and because of that, they die. Mr. President, I agree we need to do all we can to address many of the social issues that my colleague from Vermont highlights, particularly during this pandemic. But here's what we must never do as a Congress: gut our military readiness to such a degree that our young men and women come home in body bags as opposed to victors. And by the way, that's what happened in the summer of 1950. And, Mr. President, we were on a path towards this dangerous lack of readiness during the second term of the Obama administration. I just cited numbers. I chair the Readiness Subcommittee. I've been all focused on this issue of rebuilding our readiness. And here's the good news. With the Republicans in control in the Senate and the White House, we have begun to dramatically rebuild our military and our readiness. This has been a priority of ours. This has certainly been a priority of mine. And many of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, particularly on the Armed Services Committee, have been working on rebuilding our military. When we were looking at these numbers, so many people on the Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed just gave a very eloquent speech, we recognized, whoa, dangerous world, dangerous neighborhood, military that's not ready. So we got to work. Mr. President, I enjoy my bipartisan work here in the Senate. Some of my best friends are from the other side of the aisle. But there are principal disagreements on key issues between some on this side of the aisle and the other side. One of them is the whether and how and the full degree to which we support our military and national defense. Now, I know all of my colleagues are patriotic. I don't like doing the patriotism argument. Every member of this body, all 100, we love our military. When you look at history, we love our country. We love our country, all 100. But there is some impressions when you look at what goes on here and you look at the sweep of history with regard to readiness and funding our military. Again, to my Democratic colleagues on the Armed Services Committee, Defense Approps, who like me attend the hearings regularly, dig into the issues, know the threats our country faces, I think we've worked together to rebuild readiness. But at the national level, Mr. President, here are the facts. Think about it. Carter, Clinton, Obama, Biden, What do those administrations all have in common? They get into power and they cut our military. And morale plummets and readiness plummets. Let me go a little bit closer to home. Since I've been elected, the number one bill my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have filibustered, number one bill, when they want to take something hostage, is the defense appropriations bill. 10 times since I've been in this body. The funding for our men and women gets pulled in as a hostage 10 times. No other bill in the last 5.5 years since I've been here has been filibustered more than the defense appropriations bill. Now, our friends in the media never report on this, but that is one of the issues that really burns me up here, because it happens all the time. And trust me, our troops know it. They watch it and they know it. So now, Mr. President, we have the Sanders Amendment for across-the-board DOD cuts of 14%, just as we are digging out of the readiness hole that we all know that we're in. And if you don't acknowledge it, you're not paying attention. The Senate Minority Leader has recently come out in favor of the Sanders Amendment. I wonder where Joe Biden is on the Sanders Amendment. Of course, as my colleague from Illinois just mentioned, the Pentagon must do a better job of managing waste and cost overruns. I fully agree with that. And in fact, the Trump administration was the first administration that finally undertake an audit of the Pentagon. Again, something Democrats and Republicans on the Armed Services Committee pressed for. And we finally got it. Took decades, but an audit of the Pentagon has finally happened. But, Mr. President, make no mistake, the Sanders Amendment is the first salvo in the National Democratic leadership's goal of defunding the military across the board. And if you don't want to take my word for it, here's the Politico op-ed from Senator Sanders about his amendment titled, quote, "Defund the Pentagon, the liberal case." Defund the Pentagon. There they go again, Mr. President. This is a really important issue. I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle defeat this amendment overwhelmingly. Overwhelmingly. The men and women of the military are watching this amendment. Men and women of the military know that their readiness 5 years ago was in a really bad state. And Mr. President, the vote today and what's going to happen later, literally, if you look at history, we never know when the next conflict's coming. We didn't know that in the summer of 1950, that the military was going to be rushed to the Korean Peninsula and would barely be able to hold its own, and thousands died because they weren't ready, because of defense cuts by the Congress and the executive branch and the Pentagon. So this is an important vote. The lives of the men and women in our military and their readiness could well depend on this vote. And I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to strongly reject it. I yield the floor.